Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lenore Erickson-Hatulski. I'm the Vice President for Social Policy and Politics at Third Way. And at Third Way, we are obsessed with federal policy that might help improve student outcomes within higher education. We think a big piece of that is the foundation of that, actually, is the data that we have about student outcomes. And so we've put together a three-part series, and this is the third of that three-part series. So over the past couple of months, we did an event talking about how we can use data to help students select schools that are the right ones for them. And then we talked about how institutions can use data to make sure that students are completing the degree that they've selected. And now we're doing the third component, which is how can we use data to better connect the higher education system to the workforce needs that we have in the country. So I'm very excited that all of you are here to join us today. I will tell you that either if you're watching the live stream or in person, you can join us on Twitter at #HigherEdData if you'd like to participate in the conversation. And I'm going to now turn it over to Tamara Heiler, who is our Senior Policy Advisor and Higher Education Campaign Manager, to take us the rest of the way. Tamara?
Thanks, Lenore. Ooh, I guess we're doing this talk show style today. So thank you guys all for joining us for our grand finale of our three-part series. We're really excited and glad you all could make it. It's exciting to see some new faces and also some familiar faces who've been at the other events earlier in this series. So I think, as Lenore mentioned, the name of this series is really helping students use data to get to and through college. And I do think that there's a little bit of a misnomer in this name, in the sense that while it's one thing, we should be doing everything we can to make sure we're increasing access and getting students to select the right schools, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that students are actually graduating once they start. I think that this third conversation, and really an important conversation that needs to be had, is, these degrees, if they're not actually connected to the workforce and the job market and what the needs are, then we're really providing a disservice to students, even if they are graduating. So I'm really excited to be here today with this esteemed panel, and you all have more thorough bio sheets on your chairs. But to my left, I have Lenore Rodicio, who's the Executive Vice President and Provost for Miami-Dade College. And I'm very grateful she got on a plane to come visit DC in December and left Miami behind. And next to her, we have Brian Wilson, who's the Director of the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, which is part of the National Skills Coalition. And then down at the far end, we have Bob Sheets, who is a research professor in areas of workforce, education, and economic policy at George Washington University, and also a fellow at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. So to really kick this off, and I know you all are all familiar with this, and especially those of you on the panel, we know that by 2018, about 2/3 of all U.S. jobs are actually going to require some form of post-secondary education. And we also know that, according to federal data, that only about 6 in 10 students who start college are finishing. And even for those who do, a recent survey of employers found that they're still having difficulty actually filling jobs for available roles that they have. So in doing some research for this panel, I was on the Chamber of Commerce website, and President Donahue, there's a little video, he said it pretty nicely. He said, we have people without jobs, and we have jobs without people. So really today I want to kick off this panel and give each of you to first start off by talking about, given this disconnect, I'd like for you to each go down the line and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing both in and with institutions and the business community to make sure that students who are completing their post-secondary degrees are getting the skills that they need to find meaningful jobs once they're in the workforce. So I'll start it off with Lenore.
Sure. That's a great question, Tamara. I think for those of us in higher education, we've gotten to a point in time now where it's extremely important for us to be able to connect our students with job opportunities upon completion for 2 reasons. Number one, our economy needs it. And number 2, the students are investing quite a bit in order to attain a higher education credential. And in order for them to see a return on investment, they need to have a high-paying job once they graduate. And that return on investment also translates for those of us at public institutions to the taxpayers in the states and so forth. So there are a lot of repercussions, a lot of stakeholders who are engaged in this question. And I think a lot of institutions have done this in great ways, and others still struggle to do it. I think for us at the community college level, it's an inherent part of what we do day in and day out, and an absolute necessity to be able to connect our students with jobs in the community. And so we work personally at Miami-Dade College with the local employers, not only to identify job opportunities for students to move into, but to actually have the employers provide us with advice and counseling on the types of skills that students need and how we can better improve our programs in order to meet their needs. And so it becomes a win-win situation. They're directly involved in our program development, and we provide graduates that can immediately move into the workforce and help satisfy their needs for a skilled workforce in whatever business it is that they're engaged in. So for us, it's part of our daily business. It's what we do, and it's something that we feel that we owe to our students. The majority of our students come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and this is their one shot at really breaking that cycle of poverty that has just become almost an inheritance from the family circles that they come from.
Thank you, Tamara. At the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, we've been working the last couple of years on a project known by its acronym SWEEP, which stands for the State Workforce and Education Alignment Project, in which we are trying to help policymakers, particularly at the state level, but also at the institution level, to better align their programs of study with employment opportunities in their labor market. For the project, we've been issuing a series of publications and providing direct technical assistance to states around developing certain data tools. And I'm going to, in my opening remarks, refer to one of them, which is a way of analyzing the supply of skilled and credentialed workers compared to the demand in the labor market. So every state has a labor market information office in which there's data available on estimating the number of job openings over the next 10-year period. This information is available by each type of occupation, over 800 or so occupations, and by post-secondary education level, whether the training requires some college beyond post-secondary, beyond high school, four-year degree, graduate degree, and so forth. So there is information available on the demand side, including the forecast of the future. On the supply side, simply one can look at was the number of students who are completing so many years of education, post-secondary education and training by occupational field, and then compare that supply to the demand. How many, for example, registered nurses are completing associate degrees or baccalaureate nursing degrees per year in the state? And how does that compare to the net number of job openings for nurses in the state currently and forecasted? One can use this relatively simple methodology to analyze where are the big gaps in a state's institutional capacity in producing these skilled workers, the skilled and educated workers that employers need. Now, it's not totally precise. There is some margin of error. But in every state, I would suspect one can find where there are large gaps between what is being supplied by the higher education institutions and what is demand in the labor market. And policymakers can focus on closing those large gaps with certain policy changes. Our project isn't just about producing the data. It's not really what it's about. It's about producing the policy changes to close those skill gaps. So policymakers can direct resources to increase the seats available at higher education institutions and certain programs of study where the capacity is insufficient to meet employer demand. States have created new programs where they have limited the enrollment in the programs to only those fields where there's a shortage of supply compared to demand. And states have also used sector partnerships of employers along with education and employment providers who look at what are the skill gaps and develop plans and implement plans to close those skill gaps. Sector partnerships can be established in the fields where supply is short of demand and help close those gaps. So those are some of the policy tools that can be implemented based upon the data, and states have done this and successfully.
Thanks. Bob?
Yes, I usually work with the Chamber of Commerce Foundation largely on the employer side, and that's through the Talent Pipeline Management Initiative. And in short, the Talent Pipeline Management Initiative is aimed at increasing employers' roles in managing their talent pipelines based on lessons learned from supply chain management. And it involves a series of strategies, one of which is to have employers organize themselves together. So it's a collaborative of employers that have agreed to work together to address a specific critical need that they both share. It's about improving the information that employers provide to their talent partners. And that information is, how many people do I need in these critical jobs, and what are the hiring requirements for those jobs? It involves them using data to actually understand where they're getting the best source of talent, who work best in their own companies, and then building partnerships based upon that data to talent sources, regardless of what those talent sources are. They could be universities, colleges, apprenticeship programs, community-based nonprofits. It's to identify with data where they get their base talent and build their talent pipelines based upon that. It is also creating shared metrics and incentives so that actually you can get performance and use continuous improvement processes like they do in other parts of their business on their talent sourcing and management processes. So again, it's using lessons learned from supply chain management to improve talent pipeline performance that creates shared value for employers, individual workers, students, as well as training providers. There's two tranches of work I'd like to kind of highlight. One is building the capacity of employer collaboratives at the state and regional level through TPM academies. And there's been 3 rounds of TPM academies. They're moving down now into the states. There's like 3 states now going to offer their own TPM academies. The other one is developing a public-private data infrastructure to allow better sourcing, talent sourcing from employers, but also better decisions for individuals at the micro level. So it's building the public-private data infrastructure for better decisions in talent pipeline management from both the supply and the demand side.
Great. So I love that we have sort of the spectrum here represented all the way from the school level to the state and also the employers. So with this question, in your opinion, and I can throw this out to anybody, why do you think that up until this point there has been such a disconnect between our higher education system and the needs of employers? And maybe this is a hot topic, but who do you think actually has the responsibility to bridge this divide?
I guess I'll begin. So in order to match supply and demand requires much better information than we have now, and for decision makers to actually use that information. Students currently do not know, for the most part, what are the labor market outcomes of different programs at different institutions. They don't know how many students get jobs. They don't know what the earnings are of those students. That information is generally not available. Institutions may have some information, but there are many factors besides labor market information they take into account in making decisions. In fact, labor market information may be kind of far down the list. So if one looks at sort of what's the incentive structure for decision-making institutions, of course, one is funding. States typically fund institutions of higher ed at a flat rate per student FTE. Well, the problem is high demand programs of study, whether they be information technology, engineering, nursing, or so forth, tend to cost more than average. So institutions have less of an incentive to provide those high demand programs. So not only does the information have to be available as to what's needed in the labor market and where institutions are falling short, folks have to be able to act on that information. As far as who bears the responsibility, I think there's responsibility at all levels. There's responsibility at federal levels, state, institution, and individual students and their families all have to bear some of the responsibility. But if I were to pick one, I would say state policymakers, because states actually provide more funding to post-secondary institutions than anyone else does, and they have, therefore, greater potential for exercising authority to guide institutions to be responsive to the labor market.
Yeah, I can say, I'm going to frame the disconnect in kind of a general challenge they all face. One is, imagine a talent marketplace in which on the employer side, things are changing, skill requirements are changing faster and faster and faster. The actual half-life of a skill is being reduced, right? So imagine that. Then on the supply side, our lead times are growing. The time it takes to get somebody to a credential is expanding based on the requirements. And so what if we had a different metric that said time to full productivity, not time to completion? Because completion doesn't matter. It's time to earnings from the student standpoint, right? Completion, what if I get complete and it takes me a whole year to onboard you after that to get to full productivity? So what I would like to say in terms of who's responsible, it's everybody, but let me put three things out there. One is employer signaling. We have to, it takes employer leadership. It's government, I don't think, can be in the best position to try to get this information indirectly. It's got to be coming from the employers and employer leadership to provide more continuous, more granular information on hiring requirements as they move faster. Remember I said things move faster? Second of all, it's flexibility in how I deliver services. If through all the different regulatory or accreditation issues, I am locked in to a certain way of delivering a service, and let's say it's time to earnings, I could deliver things in a much more flexible way that involved earn and learn opportunities, for example, or other delivery models that reduce time to full productivity. So number one, flexibility. Think about all the way what you all deal with on a regular basis that locks in or assumes a certain type of delivery, that it's not intentional, but the way you write things locks it in to a certain way of delivering. The last one is measures and incentives. If I don't have shared metrics, many times our public metrics reward people for then not necessarily providing value to the employers. What we need is shared metrics and incentives. And what I meant was, imagine if you had time to earnings as the metric and you incented people to do that versus measures matter, but the incentives have to be aligned to those measures. And those are the three buckets I would put into. And all those three means everybody's got to be part of the solution.
From a practitioner standpoint, at a community college level, first, in terms of who holds a responsibility, it's all of the above. Everybody has a share in the responsibility for getting students through and through college and into a viable employment. I think where the challenges are many of the things that Bob referred to. The incentives are misplaced if what we're trying to do is rapid workforce training. And we're stuck in a system that's bound by the structure that was developed hundreds of years ago to train individuals for an entirely different way of life than what we're trying to train them for now. But we're still bound by the same mechanisms. We're still bound by the credit hour. We're still bound by the traditional degrees. We've been trying to break free of that a little bit at the community college level by increasing the number of industry certifications, college credit certificates, non-credit training that allows students and adult learners to upgrade their skills and be able to move forward in employment. But a lot of the times, those things aren't the ones that are rewarded. You're rewarded for students completing a degree. You're rewarded for students who complete a degree in a given amount of time. But the incentive for things that really tie them back to the workforce, that help to upgrade those skills, that's not there. And that's where the biggest challenge is for institutions. We're being asked to innovate and to break ground in training a new workforce for the country with high technological skills in high demand areas, but we're working within the same structures, the same metrics, and the same systems. And so it becomes difficult to innovate when you don't have the flexibility to do that. One asks, well, why don't colleges put up programs that better meet the needs of employers? It's hard. I mean, we're an institution that is regularly putting out new programs that are specifically tied to workforce needs, but it's difficult. You have to meet with the employers, understand what their needs are, convince the faculty to help develop the program, find faculty who have the right skills to help teach the courses in the technology fields. Being able to offer a competitive salary to someone who can make twice as much, 3 times as much out in industry becomes a challenge for higher education institutions. And then once you get through those barriers, let alone any of the state regulations for offering new programs and or accreditor regulations. So it becomes just this cycle that by the time you're able to put up a program, it's at best 1 year after you first identified the need, 2 years, and then now if the students have to sit in a classroom for 2 years to complete at least an associate's level, now you're at 3-4 years after you first identified the need in the workforce. That's where the struggle is. And that's where our institutions are struggling to meet this intense pressure from employers to have graduates that meet their needs, but at the same time trying to work with all of these regulatory systems that just don't allow for the innovation to happen.
Great. So I think you guys led very nicely into this next question, that there is shared responsibility amongst the players at this table, but also we're in the United States Capitol. There's active higher education legislation moving. So what is the number one thing that the federal government could do to actually make your jobs easier and help you to meet some of these needs and the problems that you've identified?
Yeah, I would put them in 2 buckets. And when I talk, because I work at the state level as well, so but let me say government in general, but also with the fiscal and the federal, I put it in 2 general buckets. Is look through all the stuff you're dealing with and ask the question, are you providing employers a clear role and the incentives to play that role to deal with the things that I was just talking about with talent pipeline management? Is that, do you really have it clear where they're given the space, responsibility, are given the space mostly, and the incentives to play that role? That's number one. And I think you can look that across all the different pieces of legislation you all deal with to ask that one question. That's the one litmus test. The other one is think in the future that if you want all players to make micro decisions based upon data, which I'm hoping you will, think that we need to have employers having the access to the right data, the credentialing organizations, higher educational institutions, and students themselves. And I think what we need to ask the question is, what is the future public-private data infrastructure that will enable that to happen, that can actually be used in talent sourcing, improving based upon data, and also in terms of student choices and institutional decisions? So I think you all deal with federal issues that deal in both of those buckets. So I think those are the 2, I think, the biggest high-impact decision points, at least at the federal and state levels.
I would just add to that, I think one of the challenges that we face and I keep coming back to my role as an institutional leader, one of our challenges is the disparate systems for collecting data and for sharing data. We have different systems at the state level, at the national level, and they don't necessarily answer the questions that need to be answered in terms of the population of students that we serve. So for the most part, the population of students that's measured is the first-time, full-time cohort. Those are not the students at a community college. The bulk of our students are part-time students. The bulk of them are returning students. Many of them are those who have stopped out. But for all intents and purposes, they don't count when you look at the higher education landscape and what's being measured. And then when you look at the burden on an institution for providing data, we have one set of data requirements at the federal level. In Florida, we have a student unit record system, but that requires a different set of reporting mechanisms as well. Someone the other day was talking about the accountability at the community college level and how it could be strengthened. And my response to that was, I feel like I'm sending a report every other week. How much more accountability do you want from us? But that becomes a challenge because we have these different data collection mechanisms, but none of them are the ones that can help me as an institutional leader determine what my student sitting in my classroom, who's part-time and not counted in these other cohorts that are being measured, needs as a student in order to be able to complete his or her degree and find meaningful employment. That, I think, is where our biggest challenge is. And so if we want to continue measuring the traditional students who go to the traditional four-year institutions, then by all means, let's continue measuring what we're measuring. But if we are really looking to measure the bulk of the population of college attendees in this nation and the ones who are really going to make an impact in the workforce of the future, we have to rethink the way that we currently measure student success.
Yeah, I agree with all the points that have been made. There is legislation currently before Congress that would create a national public-facing website that would provide students and their families with information on what is the results of each program of study or major at each higher education institution in the nation that is eligible under the Higher Education Act to receive financial aid, so that students and their families could look up, if I am going to take the welding program at X community college, what is the completion rate there? What is the employment rate? What's the earnings of their former students? And compare that to other welding programs elsewhere, or whatever program or major someone's interested in. There are states that have stepped up and provided such information for their states. Washington State, Minnesota, North Carolina, each has a good public-facing website that provides that type of information. But there's only so far that states can go on their own. So obviously, for example, there's inconsistency in how these things are measured from one state to another. So if someone's thinking of going to one institution or another in different states, they have no way of comparing the two. So like I said, there is legislation before Congress that would set up a national system to provide this type of information, and it would require the repealing of the national ban in the Higher Education Act on a student unit record system and enable institutions to provide some of the information they're now providing through surveys and other means through a much simpler and less expensive, more efficient process.
Great. So I think so often when we turn to a data conversation, and we've mentioned this at some of the other events, oftentimes we're talking about statistics and not real humans and students on the ground. And so as we're thinking about real students' lives that are at stake here, and as you're mentioning the part-time students that are at your school that you're not getting the correct information for today, what are some stories that I think can illustrate just what's at stake here? Because so often, this is really the difference between a student being able to get a meaningful degree that will allow them to eventually pay back their student loans and see some sort of return on investment from their higher education experience. So, Lenore, you can start, but others are welcome to chime in.
Sure. And so I can pick from numerous stories of our students. We had a recent graduate who had dropped out of the educational system shortly after high school, was homeless for some time, finally decided to come back to the college, met with an individual. This student went on to be one of the student leaders at the institution, graduated with honors, and is now on his way to completing a baccalaureate degree. That is a success story, but it's not one of the students who's considered traditional, one of the ones that's not measured in the cohort because he didn't go to school full-time. He went to school part-time. But then I think that the richer story at the community colleges is we've been seeing over the past few years a disinvestment in community colleges, in public higher education, and that is a true disservice to the population of students that we serve. If we look at just one recent graduate from our institution, he was able to complete his baccalaureate degree at our college. We have a number of baccalaureate degrees in high-demand workforce areas. The cost of tuition for this student, total cost of tuition, was $14,900. The amount of aid that he received between Pell, scholarships, institutional dollars that we provided to him was $26,800. So not only was he able to pay for his tuition and fees, he was also able to use the additional dollars that he received from scholarships to be able to pay for the cost of living for himself and for his family. He is a child of an immigrant family. He's been in this country since he was 8 years old. He completed his baccalaureate degree, immediately was offered a job within the community, and is now making $70,000 a year. That's a return on investment. And those are the types of stories that you hear over and over again from the community colleges. But they're not your traditional students. They're not the ones that typically get measured when you talk about a data conversation. But their stories are just as important. And so it's easy to make decisions when you're just looking at numbers on a sheet of paper. But there are individual stories behind this. I can tell the story of the students who come to my institution. Over 60% of them are low-income students. About half of them live below the poverty line. Most of them are on some type of federal aid, but they make it through our institution, are able to contribute back to the local economy. 90% of our graduates are found employed within 1 year of graduation. That's a return on investment, and those are the stories we need to start telling, the ones that have a name and a face and an individual to them, not just a group of numbers, that at the end of the day really don't have a meaning behind what is actually occurring at the institutional level.
If I could just reinforce, I don't have any specific stories to share, but I want to reinforce the great point made. Many times when I see stories, especially around student financial aid, I get the typical traditional student stories. I get the story of the 18-year-old or the 19-year-old making a decision about what college to attend or what graduate program to attend. And we look at the numbers right now on the post-traditional students, they're more like that. And so also I want to know is that you're also having students making investment decisions in a wide variety of credentials that include industry certifications, a lot of different things. So imagine a lot of them are working and are working in the workplace with employers being a partner in this effort. So what we need is all these different stories for you all to hear so you can actually say, what's the importance of broader access to earn and learn opportunities for people that have to support their families while they're doing things? What about students that have to finance a certification exam, which may mean, on the face of it, look like a small amount of money, but it's significant money. So I think what we need to do is get a better set of use cases for whether it's financial aid, whether it's any sort of federal package, so that we're getting a more typical array of case studies that represents over 3/4 of the population as opposed to the 1/4 in which most of our examples come from when we write federal legislation.
Great. So to build off of that a little bit, and I know you've started to touch on this, as we're thinking about creating a system that will count all students and trying to create a more streamlined sort of higher ed to workforce pipeline, what metrics specifically should we be looking at? So I know, Bob, you mentioned sort of time to earnings, but are there other metrics that we should be thinking about as we're creating a system that will be inclusive of all types of students?
Yeah, I think, and let me tell you a couple design principles for metrics, and then give you some examples. How about that? The first of all is you need balanced shared value metrics. So you've got to have employer metrics as well as individual or supply side metrics, and they have to be aligned so they're not competing with one another. So in other words, I could have a college be an incentive to hit some metrics that may reduce value to the employer. And many times I see situations where those metrics collide with one another, and we have two parties being incented to do things that are inconsistent. Next is we need to have balanced metrics that deal with three aspects. Quality, which is conformance to use. So in other words, is there something where a graduate is meeting the requirements of the employer. That's quality. That's fitness for intended use, right? Quality. But then you need the issue of cost, and cost has to be dealt with affordability. In other words, I could have a relatively high-priced cost that is affordable because I can finance it with higher earnings, right? And what you don't want to do, but you also don't want to give incentives to have even a moderate cost program because the expected earnings in the future, I won't be able to finance. So that's why I'm saying is you've got to put together cost metrics. The most important one that I think is the most underused metric is time. Time is money. Most low-income populations need earnings. And that's why I deal with time to full productivity and time to earnings. So back examples. If I have time to full productivity and time to earnings, think about this from a standpoint. Time to full productivity. It's important to the employer. Time is money. It's important to the student because they're earning, right? And it's also giving the best metric to the provider because they know that I may be able to shorten up certain things. I may have to put earn and learn opportunities in there, like internships, because if I'm measured based upon time to full productivity and I have the flexibility, I would design things differently. So that's an example. But again, those two design principles are the most important.
So there are other metrics, such as the ones Bob talked about, that are useful, but I would have as the starting point the common metrics that are in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, often referred to as WIOA. WIOA contains 6 common metrics, 2 of employment rates, 1 of earnings, 1 of completion rate, 1 of effectiveness in serving employers, and 1 of skill gains. And these common metrics apply to the labor exchange, to adult basic education, to vocational rehabilitation. Administratively, that was through legislation. Administratively, SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, has added the use of these metrics for their employment and training programs. The House has included them in the bills that have passed the House under the reauthorization of the Carl Perkins Career and Technical Education Act and TANF reauthorization as well. So this is growing. It's very useful for those who administer programs to have consistent goals if they're going to coordinate their efforts, and we certainly want the different programs to be working together to achieve the common ends, and to have the same metrics applied to them will facilitate that coordination. So would suggest that, those metrics be at least the starting point. Additional metrics could also be useful.
And Lenore, from the institution perspective, is there any other metrics that you'd like to see as part of this conversation?
I think both Bob and Brian brought up good metrics that I think start to get at what it is that we're trying to do. I think the other important piece is the consistency. We need to start getting all of our data systems to be consistent across the state, across the national level. It helps to reduce the burden of reporting on the institutions and helps us all to speak the same language when we're talking about student outcomes. I think that's the challenge right now. Depending on the audience that you're talking to, student outcomes are defined differently. And so we need to start getting to a shared definition of what that is actually reflects the reality of what our students are achieving.
Great. So I have time for one more question on my end, and then I want to make sure I turn it over to all of you so that you can ask questions as well. So since integrating to a more data-informed approach, both at Miami-Dade College and in the States and with employers, curious to see what sort of changes or successes have you actually seen that's provided the biggest benefit to students and employers?
So I can start with that. I think at our institution, it's created this intentionality about the way that we develop our workforce degrees. We work hand in hand with the employers. So we do not put a new workforce program on the books that hasn't been vetted with the local workforce community. So we bring in industry partners from the get-go, from the moment that we have an idea for a program to get their input. Is this something you really need? Are we aligned in terms of the competencies that we're presenting to our students? So that's been step one. Step two has been to then more intentionally create stackable credentials, because again, it goes back to what are the skills that the student needs to be employable right now, for two reasons. One, because we want to get them out into the workforce, but two, because our students need to work. They can't afford to go to school full-time and not work. It's just not the population of students that we serve. So we have been very cautiously working through all of our programs to ensure that they stack, that we have industry certifications that build into college credit certificates, that build into associate degrees, that build into baccalaureate degrees. And we present all of this information to the students up front. We show them how the different credentials that they can obtain can stack, what it means for them in terms of continuing education, and what the potential earnings are for them at each one of those levels. We look at all of our programs from a workforce earning potential so that we present to our students from the get-go, and even when we're trying to get approval for a program at the institutional level with our Board of Trustees, and if we need to move it forward for state approval depending on the program, that those employment metrics are there, showing the number of jobs that will be available in the region and the potential earnings for students when they graduate. So all of those have become the decision-making process at the institution. Input from the employers, the stackability of the credentials to ensure lifelong learning if needed for the students, and then trying to ensure that it's tied to good employment data within the community.
I'm going to use an example from Washington State where I used to work. When we did a supply-demand analysis in Washington State, we were able to identify the programs of study where institutions weren't providing enough graduates to meet employer demand. And we found that healthcare was such an area, and particularly registered nurse programs was such an area, that the state was only graduating half as many registered nurses per year as there were net job openings per year at hospitals and other facilities. And it wasn't because of a lack of student interest or a lack of qualified students. Almost every program had a waiting list of students to get in who were qualified. So we did a couple of things after we did this data analysis. We earmarked money for what we called high-demand FTEs. I think it was about $10 million, where institutions could submit proposals to create new programs to close gaps between supply and demand. Many of the proposals were in healthcare, particularly for registered nurses. The other thing we did was in each of the workforce development areas in the state, we required the establishment of a sector partnership in healthcare, where the education and training providers would sit down with the hospitals, with the other employers, and develop a plan for closing the gaps, such as lending employees from hospitals to serve as faculty part of the time, lending equipment from hospitals to provide expensive equipment that colleges were having trouble affording, and other things in addition to providing more seat capacity at the institutions. Through things such as this, in a 7-year period, we took that gap of where we were having a supply that was only 50% of demand and eliminated the gap, where supply and demand were in equilibrium, achieved that within about 7 years.
Yeah, I was thinking the best place to find examples would go up on U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation website, Talent Pipeline Management, and they have all these different case studies that I think would be useful for you to look at. If I just highlight a couple, a couple examples of case studies. One, there you'll see up there how different employers have established college partnership programs based on analysis of where they get their best students. And so the idea is if they manage that as talent pipelines, that would be going to those institutions that provide the best fit for the students and actually providing them with partnerships and deep partnerships of communication. So those are examples of employers that have actually dealt with more of a talent pipeline management solutions. And the other ones are training providers, innovative training providers, for example, that have cut the time to productivity in half based upon detailed information from employers about what is really necessary in terms of hiring requirements and also what the employer could take on versus the school could take on in terms of joint responsibility for building talent. So that gets to my comment about the most important thing is time. We can no longer we can't close the skill gap if we have things moving fast on one side and longer lead times on the other side. With a disconnect, we can't get there. So it really takes new strategies on both sides, and those cases, I think, could show that. Or at least you could provide examples of what could be done.
Okay, so I have one more question as a follow-up to this, and then I'll turn it over to you all. So just based on these great examples, what do you think is the biggest challenge then to being able to sort of scale this outside of just Washington State or particular employers that you're working with or community colleges who are invested in this type of work?
I think the challenge is that we're just so ingrained in the current system that we have and the way that we measure things that it really takes a disruption to be able to break through that, and we haven't hit that point yet. And so the colleges and universities are going to keep doing what they're measured on. You get what you're measured on, right? You get what it is that is being looked at, recorded, what you're graded on. And so as long as the metrics continue being the same, we're just going to continue doing the same things because you're so busy doing that it makes it difficult to do the innovation. Some of us have managed to do a little bit of both, but in order to really do it at the scale that it needs to be done, that disruption has to occur where the metrics really start to reflect the work that we're doing.
If I can just build on that, it kind of reinforce what I said earlier. I think it's the basic 4 or 5 basic building blocks. Is you have to empower the employer side and look through every possible way from federal and state policy to enable that. The transparency issue is very important, but it's very important to give institutions, if you're giving them the right incentives and metrics, but also the flexibility to deliver. And the flexibility is so important for colleges and universities, is think about all the embedded constraints we make in how you produce a service for a student or an employer and how fast you can do it. And I think those are the fundamental building blocks of the federal and state policy. And that's preventing, I think there's all these great examples of workarounds. And I can give a case after case of workarounds. But workarounds don't get you to scale. And it burns people out. So the most important thing, I think, is completely re-engineer in ways that build on those 4 building blocks.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenges now are not ones that are technical in nature. And there are technical challenges, and people like Bob will fix those. But the biggest challenge is really political will. The will of policymakers at the federal level, the state level, at the institution level, to put a higher emphasis on aligning higher education with what employer needs are. That has to have a greater emphasis, it has to have a greater priority, and that's a matter of the political will of these policymakers to do that.
If I can ask one more thing, like I guess I do this translation. When somebody says higher ed to me, I think of all post-secondary education and training opportunities. If you look at the numbers, higher education traditionally is about 50%, right? So the issue is, how do you integrate all opportunities for employers and learners to get post-secondary training and credentials? And so higher education, I think, has to be looked into a larger idea. I call it the talent marketplace, but to me it's post-secondary. You could probably put in a high school in there too, but it's basically, it's the larger post-secondary marketplace for talent and anything that creates distinctions out and breaks that up is not doing a service to employers or learners.
Yeah, we do a lot of public opinion research at Third Way and have been talking to people about this idea of college and how you define that. And we're definitely seeing a shift in terms of how people are defining it away from just the sort of 4-year Ivy, you went and lived on campus type of experience that we've seen in the past. So agree. All right, I will turn it over now, and Molly has a microphone since we are live streaming. So if anyone has a question.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Lenore Erickson-Hatulski from Third Way. I'm curious if you all can talk a little bit about how the connections between institutions and employers work in a small business context. I've seen a lot of great examples of bigger businesses, or if you're the big employer or a big employer in a place, you have a lot more leverage and maybe infrastructure to do some of the things that you're talking about. But we have a lot of small businesses that also need talent and maybe have less of the infrastructure to do the kind of outreach work that you've talked about. So what can we do for our small businesses?
I can. One thing you can go up there on the TPM website as well is to look at what we're promoting is employer collaboratives, where small, mid-sized, and larger employers come together and organize themselves, because in most cases, small and even mid-sized employers really don't have the consistent leverage and mechanism, including staff support, to actually work effectively with their education and training partners. And what we are also dealing with is employer and small and mid-sized employers actually working together to address common needs, but it's using a common language to describe differences, not just all having to agree on the lowest common denominator. And if we think of small and mid-sized employers who would take the leadership role working through their business organizations to organize, then they'll be more effective partners with their education and training providers who have to spend a lot of time and effort trying to engage employers. And so we think it should be more the small and mid-sized employers getting together to actually orchestrate to get better leverage and better internal capacity to get it done.
Yeah, we think the sector partnerships, which I've mentioned a couple of times, are a great avenue for small and medium-sized employers to be engaged with post-secondary institutions. Under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, every workforce development area in the nation has to have multiple sector partnerships in place. So that's nationwide over 1,000 that are supposed to be up and running. So these provide a great place where employers can get engaged, not just the large employers, but the small and medium-sized employers as well.
So we've worked on this on two fronts. One, we've partnered with Goldman Sachs on their 10,000 Small Business Program and provide some very focused training to small businesses in the community, and now have had a number of cohorts go through with all of those businesses showing successful gains after they've participated in the program. So that's one of the connections that we have to the small businesses primarily in our community. But the other is the development of something we call the Idea Center, which came about a little over 2 years ago now. And that's the entrepreneurial hub for the college, but I would also say for the community. And so what we've done through the Idea Center is opened up quick training for 21st century workforce training to anyone in the community. And so the bulk of the individuals who've made use of those services are individuals from small to medium-sized businesses in the local communities, entrepreneurs in the community who don't have the capacity yet within the workforce that they've currently employed to get at things like digital marketing, like coding and programming. And so we bring them in and help them with those short training programs that help build capacity within their businesses.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason D'Souza, and I am an associate professor of higher education at Howard University. Bob, this question is probably for you. I really appreciate the term work to earnings. Given that unique perspective, which is important for students at historically black colleges and universities, I wonder if you could speculate on what the role is of the workforce environment to help improve the graduation rates for students at historically black colleges and universities.
Great. I think just from the employer side is to have employers actually develop stronger partnerships, but also give better connections to those students earlier in their careers. So in many cases, a lot of the leading employers are discovering talent long before students show up at a career fair. They're discovering talent. They're analyzing their own data, where do they get their best people from. And I would love to see your colleges talk to employers. And you probably know where all your students are getting the best success. Where if you know where your students are getting the best success, then develop deep partnerships with those employers. Use your own data to do that. And then the employers will see you as a deep partner. And then the most important thing I found is deep connections with the employer early on, so that we don't have internships in the final semester of a student of the senior year, that there are deep projects and activities that you can do even freshman and sophomore year. But the most important thing is work deep with employers who've already decided that because of their experience with your previous graduates, that you are a valuable source for them, and then go deep with those. I don't know if that makes sense. But I think the most important thing, and sometimes it's difficult for faculty who are now bringing, in a sense, kind of a co-faculty member into the ranks early on. And many times that's kind of, but the students love it. So that's just some thoughts.
Hi, Jeff King with National Governors Association. Quick question for Lenore. I noticed that you guys have a lot of philanthropic partners in the work that you all do, and just curious what types of investments maybe that they've assisted with in the measurement conversation that enabled you to do things that you couldn't have done otherwise. And as we look at the public sector, in sustainability, what would the public sector need to do to make those investments more sustainably on a long-term basis?
That's a great question. So we've made it a point whenever we receive investments, particularly from philanthropic organizations, to focus those on the infrastructure building activities of the college. So rather than use them for things that we're going to have to sustain later on, we use them to help reorganize. We've likened this to putting a scaffold around a building while you try and restructure the inside. So trying to figure out how we do training, how we build capacity, how we restructure internally, and try and kind of do the things we were doing before and the innovative things at the same time. And that's really what we focused our dollars on. Through our partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've done a lot of this work around completion and trying to get our students from day one to graduation more quickly. But one of the things that we found, and one of the ongoing conversations that we have in our partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is that even though the success rates have improved, it hasn't improved by the dramatic amounts that we thought that they would over the course of the past few years. And I think it goes back to something Bob said earlier. We've done a lot of workarounds, and we've been tweaking the system that we're already working in. But again, without some fundamental changes, those things don't really break through. So what we need from the public sector is the support for the day-to-day operations as a public institution. We've been seeing over the past few years disinvestment in higher ed. We had our budget cut by $5 million as an institution last year. This year, the budget doesn't look like it's going to recover those lost dollars, let alone see an increase. That starts to put a strain on resources and on what you can do in offering competitive salary to faculty. It becomes difficult to do the day-to-day work. So we need that support for the day-to-day activities of the institution, a recognition that the work we do is important, and that the measurements on what we do really start to reflect the population of students that we serve rather than punish us for it.
Any more questions?
All right, well, please join me in thanking our excellent panelists today for coming.
And I also thank you all for putting on this series. It's a great contribution. Thank you all very much.
Great, thank you. And this conversation has been live streamed, and like our others, if you missed parts 1 and 2, we have a recording of this, and this will be on our website, so you can tune in afterwards. So thank you, and I'm sure you guys will be around for a few minutes if you have any other questions.